It is one of the most spectacular adventures in the history of archaeology. In the early spring of 1873, more than 100 workers dig their way into a plain-looking hill in northwestern Turkey. Their employer, Heinrich Schliemann, a multi-millionaire from Germany, is searching for the ruins of Troy, the legendary city whose downfall was celebrated by Homer in his epic poem, the Iliad. And luck seems to smile on Schliemann. He actually finds a treasure. To him, it is the gold of King Priam. At last he has proven that Troy really did exist. But it wasn't quite like that. Important details in Schliemann's version are part of a skillfully staged legend. An ancient papyrus now reveals which battlefield Schliemann really came across. The legend of the fantastic discovery of Troy goes all the way back to Christmas Eve, 1829. As Heinrich Schliemann wrote in his memoirs 50 years later, he received a book for Christmas, a book that would influence his whole life, the illustrated World History for Children. His father had often told him about the Trojan War, about its heroes and the fortress which disappeared from the face of the earth. According to Schliemann, it was on that Christmas Eve that he made up his mind that one day he would excavate Troy. As a 7-year-old, he gazed with fascination at the famous picture of the Trojan prince Aeneas fleeing from the burning city with his son and his father. This childlike enthusiasm for Troy is only part of the dramatic story Heinrich Schliemann creates when looking back on his life's work. He blends fact and fiction with remarkable virtuosity. This talented self-promoter exploits the epic of the Trojan War, the founding myth of the Western world, to secure his own brilliant place in history. The site Heinrich Schliemann identified as Troy is still one of the most famous digs in the history of archaeology. Today, more than 130 years after the ground was first broken here, a team under Professor Ernst Pernitzka of Tübingen University carries on the work Schliemann began.
Troy has always been a legend, a gigantic work of literature. So from the beginning, there was a dispute whether the myth bore any relation to reality. And that was the reason people began searching for Troy. They knew it had to be here along the Dardanelles, if it existed. But no one could establish its exact location in the Troad.
The Troad, or Troas, is an area on the northwestern coast of present-day Turkey. Europe and Asia are separated here by the Dardanelles, a waterway that connects the Mediterranean with the Black Sea. People have searched here for Troy since the days of antiquity. Heinrich Schliemann is 46 years old in August 1868 when he first approaches the site where gods and heroes fought. By this time, he has already had a remarkable career. He has earned millions as a businessman and investor. In 1864, he retires and begins to travel the world. Schliemann has decided to dedicate the rest of his life to science. In the Troad, he searches for the sites described in the Iliad, the masterpiece of his favorite poet, Homer, the greatest author of antiquity. The epic poem, probably written in the 8th century BC, is a story of both war and love. Paris, the son of the Trojan king Priam, abducts the beautiful Helen from Sparta. In order to avenge this dishonor, the Greeks, led by King Agamemnon, sail to Troy with 1,000 ships. But despite a 10-year siege, they are unable to conquer the strongly fortified city. The turning point only comes through a cunning ruse. The Greeks build a wooden horse in which they hide their most skilled warriors. Then they pretend to retreat. The Trojans haul the Greeks' apparent gift to their gods into the fortress as a war trophy. During the night, the invaders climb out of their hiding place and open the city gates. Troy is burned to the ground. Homer's works mean more to Heinrich Schliemann than just a collection of poetic verses. He believes in their historical essence. 19th century scholars assume that the remains of the fortress are located on a hill called the Balli-Dagh. When his guide points it out, after hours on horseback, Schliemann feels elated. For him, it is the first view of the Promised Land. Traces of an ancient settlement had, in fact, been discovered on the ridge. The current head of the Troy project is on his way to the Balli-Dagh, 130 years after Schliemann. Grave robbers have looted an ancient graveyard once again. Ernst Penitzka inspects the damage together with his assistants. The traces are quite fresh. At least 4 amphora burial sites from around 800 BC have been dug up and destroyed. Valuable information about the history of the hill has been lost forever. But does this hill hold answers about ancient Troy, too? As a matter of fact, numerous details from Homer's Iliad correspond to this location.
There are several reasons for assuming that Troy might have been here. We have a hill that overlooks the entire plain, we have the Scamander River, we have the burial mound, which can be interpreted as a hero's grave, and we have a view of the sea.
Schliemann, however, is disappointed by his first impression. It seems impossible to him that Achilles chased Hector, as depicted by Homer, 3 times around the fortress here. The terrain is much too rugged. Again and again, Schliemann compares the descriptions in the Iliad with the actual location. From where he stands, it would take 4 hours to reach the sea on foot, he is told. Rising above the horizon is, in fact, the island of Tenedos, where the Greek fleet is said to have hid. And there is a convenient bay where an entire army could have come ashore.
It is presumed that the Greek fleet anchored here in Beshik Bay during the 10-year siege. There are several reasons for that. One of the few sources of fresh water is located here. There are natural springs. The bay, which has become heavily silted in the meantime, was much deeper around 1200 BC, and the island as a whole is compatible with the description in the Iliad.
But for Schliemann, the coast seems to be too far away from the Balli-Dagh. He is certain that no army could have marched up from the sea, fought an exhausting battle before the walls of Troy, and retreated all the way back in one day. He investigates another piece of evidence. Homer speaks of 2 springs where the Trojan women washed their laundry. Their special feature? One was hot and one was cold. As a matter of fact, there are several springs on the Balli-Dagh. Schliemann measures the temperature of each one. They are all 17.5 degrees centigrade. Very little complies perfectly with the information in the Iliad. So the Balli-Dagh theory must be wrong, if the references in Homer's masterly poem are accurate. Following his lack of success on the Ballydag, Schliemann has no more clues where to look. Discouraged, he is about to return to Athens, and the story of Troy's famous discoverer would have been over. But Schliemann misses the ship. He waits for the next passage in the coastal town of Çanakkale. And by coincidence, he meets an English diplomat, Frank Calvert, an encounter that will change his life and the history of archaeology.
Entschuldigen Sie, sir.
Schliemann passes the time reading, and soon he is lost on the verses and imagery of his favorite poem. Seeing the name of the author on the spine of this unknown European's book, Calvert assumes he has found a kindred spirit and introduces himself as a great admirer of Homer's works. Calvert invites Schliemann to his home. Their conversation centers on one topic: Troy. Calvert is an amateur archaeologist. Contrary to the prevailing opinion that focuses on the Ballydag, he believes that the true site of Troy is a few kilometers further on, buried under a hill called Hisarlik. Calvert's enthusiasm revives Schliemann's hopes. Fate, it seems, has given him his second chance. Calvert is so convinced of his theory that he has purchased part of the land, and first test excavations are very promising. His finds indicate an ancient settlement on the hill. The artifacts salvaged by Frank Calvert are now exhibited in the Archaeological Museum of Çanakkale.
Frank Calvert's activities are of great significance for archaeology because they pointed the way for Schliemann. Calvert systematically collected pottery here, and he even purchased the eastern side of the hill for further research. But he didn't have the necessary funds to go through with it alone, and in Schliemann he found the ideal partner.
On October 11th, 1871, Schliemann begins his excavations at Hisarlik and goes about it with the same determination and thrust that made him a millionaire. About 100 years after Johann Joachim Winckelmann had established archaeology as a serious science, a new era begins. Schliemann doesn't only long for Troy in his mind, he's perfectly capable of getting his hands dirty. Frank Calvert, who has provided a decisive clue, is soon eclipsed by Schliemann's ego and zeal. Even today, the idea that the literary origins of the Western world are based on historical foundations has lost none of its appeal. The hillside is currently being excavated to find out more about the rich history of Hisarlik. This earth, saturated with myths, continues to give up innumerable artifacts, each carefully documented and registered for posterity. The central collecting point for every find is the Troy Excavation House. Tons of material arrive here to be cleaned, sorted, and finally evaluated. What appears to be an unimpressive pile of refuse to a layman becomes valuable historical data to the expert. Together with the archaeologists, there are geologists, botanists, zoologists, and anthropologists deciphering the news from the past. In addition to fragments of artifacts, the occasional human bones are particularly revealing. This skull belonged to a man who was 6 feet tall and didn't die of natural causes.
When we discovered the skeleton, we immediately noticed an injury with sharp edges, possibly a clue as to how this person died. It could have been an injury caused by a blow, a sword, or a similar instrument.
Was the dead man a victim of the Trojan Wars? Did he fight against the Greeks around 1200 BC? A closer examination offers a different picture.
Putting the skull together, we realized that there was a total of 5 incisions. That means we are talking about a skull operation, known as a trepanation. The patient, a 35-year-old man, had suffered a skull trauma, a lesion on the side of the skull. This caused a constant headache and made the operation necessary.
Any operation in the Bronze Age was extremely risky.
First, the patients were immobilized. Probably herbs or alcohol were used as an anesthetic. Then the scalp was slit open and folded back. Finally, an incision was made in the skull with a sharp obsidian knife. This operation was not successful, however. A vital artery was severed, and the patient bled to death.
No warrior's death, then. But the age of the skull does not coincide with the Trojan War either. This man died around 500 years earlier, about 1700 BC. Schliemann hopes that the Hill of Hissarlik will secure him a place in the annals of famous discoverers, and he has a distinct vision of his future image. He gets a divorce from his first wife, a Russian. When he finds the fabled Troy, he wants a Greek spouse at his side. A friend brokers a marriage deal with the parents of 17-year-old Sophia Ingastromenou. Once married to a man 30 years her senior, Sophia falls into a severe depression. At times she is so unhappy she would rather die, as she confides to a friend. But for Schliemann, the Greek woman at his side is an important part of his image. Sophia is supposed to give his life the necessary Hellenistic luster. Reluctantly, she accepts her fate. She truly has the story of Troy drummed into her. Every evening, Schliemann reads her 280 verses from the Iliad. Being spoon-fed the world and the words of Paris and Helen by her perfectionist husband is not made easier for the young bride by the fact that she must, of course, be able to recite Homer's words in his own language, the Ionic dialect of the 8th century BC. And after the Iliad, there is the Odyssey, among whose heroines is Penelope, the ultimate long-suffering wife. The couple have 2 children. The daughter is named after Hector's wife, Andromache. Their son is given the name of the Greek overlord, Agamemnon. Light on the Schliemann's relationship is shed by the estate, which is kept in Athens, in the Gennadius Library at the American School of Classical Studies. It includes the couple's substantial correspondence. They wrote to each other extensively, since Schliemann was often traveling. The head of the archives, Natalia Vogeakov-Brogan, has assessed the letters.
It was a difficult marriage. Sophia was only 17 when she married Schliemann, and he was 50 years old and divorced. They had hard times. Early on, she was very unhappy, but they managed to survive and have a successful marriage. They exchanged very many letters. She wrote to him in many languages, in Greek and English. In one of them, we can see that despite the difficulties of the marriage, Sophia expressed her affection to her husband, She signs by saying, "I miss you, dear little Erikaki."
In order to find the fortress of Troy's king Priam, Schliemann has a trench burrowed through Hissarlik Hill. He is convinced that the fortress must constitute the deepest layer. Other walls, ruins, or structures therefore seem unimportant to him and are simply cleared away. Schliemann's mania for work leaves bold traces. The Schliemann Trench, 40 meters wide and 48 meters long, demonstrates the energy that impelled him to realize his vision.
Just picture a hill like this as if it were a cake. There's layer upon layer, and when I want to know how the layers fit together, I cut through it. And that is exactly what Schliemann did. He made what we now call a deep excavation from top to bottom. His trench is admittedly a bit wide, and it isn't as well documented as we would prefer today.
A radical excavation with a surprising result. Schliemann becomes aware that he isn't only dealing with one town. There are several settlements located here. The hillside has been inhabited for several thousand years. Like a time traveler, Schliemann has dug his way back through history.
We're on the southern side of the Schliemann Trench, and we can see before us 3,000 years of cultural history. Along the lower cut, we have 3000 BC, the beginning of the Egyptian Empire. Here we have Troy too, the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, about the same time the pyramids were erected. And then we have Troy 3 and 4, which are in between, and Troy 6, 1500 BC, and at the top, there at the highest point, the remains of the Roman settlement, around the birth of Christ.
The settlement at Hissarlik was destroyed and rebuilt several times. Up to now, a total of 10 different layers have been identified. At first, Schliemann is helpless. In which settlement layer was Homeric Troy located? The Troy of the legendary war. In the second lowest layer, he discovers scorch marks and the remains of huge walls. In his opinion, everything fits together. The walls surrounded the palace of Priam, and the scorch marks testify to its downfall. His dream seems to be within his grasp, but something is missing: archaeological proof. Sorting out the different phases of settlement on the hill has remained a challenge, even to present-day archaeologists. Every generation built upon the ruins and remains of their predecessors. That is why walls and parts of buildings from different centuries are often discovered close together, within one single excavation segment. The exact dating of individual layers is, therefore, a highly complex procedure.
We have before us approximately 1,000 years of settlement history from about 1500 BC up to and including the Hellenistic period, and somewhere in between are the traces of the Trojan War. That's what makes it so complicated.
Schliemann continues the excavation for nearly 3 years. He invests a fortune, but Germany's scholarly elite only laugh at this treasure hunter and his vision of a Homeric Troy that really existed. In the early summer of 1873, a disappointed Schliemann announces that he will stop the dig. But, according to his memoirs, he miraculously makes the discovery of the century on the day before his campaign is to end. And there's more than just something there, as the workers inform their boss. There's a whole set of delicately worked golden objects buried near one of the city's walls. 8 weeks later, on August 5th, 1873, a German newspaper reports the sensation. Heinrich Schliemann has discovered the treasure of Priam. News spreads around the world. The myth of Troy has suddenly become reality. For Schliemann, the gold is all the proof he needs. Months later in Athens, Heinrich Schliemann receives a surprising visit from the Greek police with a warrant to search Schliemann's house. Schliemann had agreed to give half of his finds to Turkey, but after discovering the gold, he wouldn't even think of sharing it. He smuggles the precious treasure to Athens. When Schliemann has himself acclaimed as the discoverer of Troy, the Turkish envoy prompts the authorities to act. Schliemann seems unimpressed and reacts rather nonchalantly to the accusations. The officials don't find a thing and are even mocked by Schliemann. The ghost of King Priam must have reclaimed his treasure one night, he quips. Schliemann has hidden his loot to keep it from confiscation by the Turkish authorities. But there are other problems. Rumors circulate that Schliemann had the treasure fabricated by a jeweler. Schliemann is furious, yet the circumstances of his discovery reveal a number of inconsistencies. Heinrich Schliemann kept a diary, but one searches in vain for a detailed entry describing how he actually found the treasure of Priam. And the details as to time and place have been changed several times. The first report dates the spectacular find to May 31st. But at that particular time, there was a hut standing on the denoted spot. This wasn't removed until a few days later, so Schliemann changed the date of the find to June 7th. The location of the find is also repeatedly corrected. The first notes describe a spot in front of the wall, but somewhere outside the wall doesn't suit Schliemann. So he changes the location from in front of the wall to on the wall.
Schliemann wanted the treasure of Priam to be directly on the wall to establish an undisputable connection with what he regarded as ancient Troy. Therefore, he might have changed the actual location of the find, but from the height he recorded, it's easy to piece together the true location, somewhere here along the wall.
It was another outright lie that Sophia helped him salvage the treasure. His Greek wife was in Athens at the time of the discovery, attending her father's funeral. Schliemann later justified the fictional role of his wife in a letter to the British Museum. He wanted Sophia to become enthusiastic about archaeology, he wrote. The inconsistencies cast a cloud over Schliemann's archaeological achievements. Truth and fiction are intertwined, and yet Schliemann, the self-educated archaeologist, was scientifically ahead of its time. In order to counter his critics, he turns to experts, like Rudolf Virchow, a renowned physician from Berlin, a procedure which was in no way common among archaeologists at that time. Virchow immediately recognizes the significance of Schliemann's finds and gives the controversial millionaire the academic support he longs for. The debate about the authenticity of the treasure prompts Schliemann to have the objects chemically examined. The result? Some of the weapons are made of copper and tin. That means Schliemann has discovered some of the earliest Bronze Age remains in the Mediterranean region. But the tests provide no evidence of Homer's legendary Troy. The treasure is now in Moscow. Schliemann rightfully purchased it for 50,000 gold francs after his legal battle with the Turkish authorities, and then bequeathed it to the German people. After World War II, the gold vanished without a trace. It wasn't until 1991 that it reappeared in Moscow's Pushkin Museum. Professor Wilfried Mengin, the director of Berlin's Museum of Prehistory and Early History, has been struggling for years to have the looted art returned, but in vain. It is unlikely that the so-called Treasure Find A will ever be returned. However, the Russians are willing to cooperate on a scholarly level.
This saucier is absolutely unique. There's no duplicate anywhere. It also has a number of marks we can investigate. They are very important for helping us determine whether the so-called treasure find A is a cohesive find or whether it was put together by Schliemann.
The analysis is intended to shed light on the question: did the gold originally come from one location, or did Schliemann put the find together, using individual pieces to create an impressive effect? One of the objects of investigation is the most famous of all the Trojan ornaments, the golden diadem.
It is really impossible to imagine this could be more than 4,000 years old. You don't expect that people back then were capable of doing such intricate gold work.
It is still unclear who the gold belonged to. It is, however, definitely not the treasure of King Priam from Homer's Iliad. Schliemann was wrong from the start. He assumed that the fortress of Priam must be down below at the base of the hillside. To him, scorch marks and the fortress wall were proof that this was his Troy lair.
Today we know that Homer's Troy is Troy 6, but Schliemann found another burned city in Lair 2, so he concluded that this was the city of the Iliad. He'd simply dug through Homer's Troy without realizing it.
The Trojan War is said to have taken place in 1200 BC. Schliemann's treasure, however, is around 1,000 years older. So the treasure in itself is no evidence for the existence of Homer's Troy. If there ever was a city conquered by the Greeks of the Iliad, it must be detectable higher up, in layers 6 to 7. And there is indeed a mighty fortress wall from exactly that period of time. More than 550 meters long and almost 8 meters high. There were also imposing defensive towers here, just as Homer described them.
The great fortress wall dates back to the early 13th century BC. It was reinforced towards the end of the 13th century, so we have signs of turmoil. Obviously, the need for protection was even greater than this stronghold was able to provide. When we compare it with the Iliad, Troy is described as an extremely beautiful city with large walls, towers and gates. There's nothing else comparable in the region, so it must have been an impregnable stronghold at that time.
But there is one thing that doesn't match the information in the Iliad. The fortress on Hisarlik is much too small. Homer describes Troy as a metropolis of several thousand inhabitants. But all that has been excavated so far is a compact castle hill. Even Schliemann had his doubts whether this settlement could have withstood a 10-year siege. The question became relevant again in 1988, when archaeologists from the University of Tübingen reopened the excavation in Troy. And they made an amazing discovery on the fortifications. At the gates of the citadel, there is no sign of a bolting device.
The particular feature of the gate is that there are no signs of a locking mechanism. The fortifying wall is extremely high and thick, but it leaves an open gap of nearly 3.5 meters, which could easily be entered by a wagon or even by a chariot. That has given cause for thought. Perhaps this wasn't the only fortification of Troy. Perhaps it was thought appropriate to scale it down at a specific moment, and perhaps there was once a lower part of town with its own fortifications.
The excavators assume there was a further city wall outside the fortifications. As a matter of fact, they find pottery from the Bronze Age at a number of spots in the vicinity, a sign that there was once a settlement outside this fortress. In order to measure the dimensions of the lower part of town, the locations where Bronze Age shards have been found are registered by the computer and linked with further data. The results of geomagnetic ground prospection are revealing. Underground objects, like bricks or walls, disrupt the Earth's natural magnetic field and are made visible by modern technology.
Using geomagnetic prospection, we're able to look between 1 and 2 meters below the ground without having to dig. And here we can see a Roman road system, the so-called insulae of Roman Ilion. That is absolutely clear. But what's exciting is a longish structure which I'm tracing here, and which has nothing to do with the system of insulae. It goes along here, and it is obvious it could have something to do with the defensive system.
The archaeologists assume there are more fortifications and start digging small test trenches along the identified line. First, as everywhere else in Troy, the remains of the Roman settlement are removed. Finding a wall, they run into a 2-meter deep, 4-meter wide shaft, chiseled into the limestone rocks.
Just imagine it. I could hardly get up here myself. If I were a Greek wearing my harness, shield, my weapons, it would be very difficult. And if there were a palisade behind it with warriors, I wouldn't stand a chance.
The trench continues for several hundred meters through the terrain. The team are convinced that the lower part of the town was quite large and located between the trench and the fortress, and that together they constituted ancient Troy. A city with more than 10,000 inhabitants. 137 years after Schliemann's excavation began, Troy's existence is now proven. But was there really a Trojan War, as Homer described it in the Iliad? Heinrich Schliemann satisfies the European craving for the heroes of ancient Greece. Public interest in his work is enormous. The educated elite are at his feet, but scientific approval is still missing. German newspapers keep on publishing his reports, and by now, even Sophia sees herself as the wife of a great explorer. But Schliemann still suffers from being labeled a half-mad dreamer chasing myths. The Iliad, to many of his contemporaries, is still no more than poetic invention. More than ever, he is determined to deliver the final proof that he is right, and that the epics of Homer are woven around a historical core. Homer describes how Agamemnon leads the Mycenaean Greeks across the Aegean Sea with an armada of 1,000 ships. He arrives in Troy to avenge the abduction of his brother's wife, Helen. Yet, scientific results now suggest different reasons for an invasion of that size. With every excavation campaign, up to 2 tons of pottery shards are collected. Among them, there are not only artifacts from the region. In the ground, there are pottery remains from the entire Mediterranean area, from Greece, Egypt, and Cyprus.
We have evidence of interregional early Bronze Age trade carried out over distances of thousands of kilometers, because the goods and materials found here are native to regions like Inner Asia.
Strategically speaking, Troy is ideally situated, near the entrance to the Dardanelles, overlooking an important trade route for ships between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Judging from the archaeological finds, this legendary city was already an important trade center in the 3rd millennium BC. There is even evidence of relations with Afghanistan, 4,000 kilometers away. Troy's resulting prosperity would certainly have whetted the appetite of its neighbors. The Mycenaeans in particular lusted for cattle, grasslands, and the treasures of neighboring settlements. In the Iliad, Achilles describes their military leader Agamemnon as the greediest for gain of all men. Wolf Dietrich Niemeyer from the German Archaeological Institute in Athens knows why.
One of the reasons why the Mycenaean Greeks expanded onto the Anatolian coast was certainly their interest in gaining access to metals. Anatolia is very rich in metal resources, and they needed the metal primarily to produce weapons.
For Schliemann, the reason for the invasion of Troy was recounted in Homer's verses: revenge for the abduction of Helen. And he would find Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks, in his own native land, Mycenae. In contrast to Troy, the location of ancient Mycenae was always known. Several ancient writers describe the heights on the Greek peninsula of the Peloponnesus as the Hill of Agamemnon. There was another reason for Schliemann to go to Mycenae, in addition to proving the historical reality of Homer's epic poem. According to legend, Mycenae was even more prosperous than Troy, and Schliemann is once again as lucky as he could be. In 1876, he actually discovers a royal cemetery. His most spectacular find is a mask of pure gold. Schliemann believes he is gazing at the likeness of Agamemnon. With his discovery of the royal tombs, Heinrich Schliemann uncovers Mycenaean culture which had been completely uncharted up to then. And he gives Greece 1,000 years of additional history.
We are standing here in front of the shaft graves of Mycenae. Women buried here were covered with gold and jewelry, wearing diadems. Men were buried with their weapons, entire armories, dozens of swords and spearheads. The burial objects also included large bronze pots. They were incredibly opulent in termins, and nothing like them is known from other periods of ancient Greece.
After discovering the gold of Troy, Schliemann has now unearthed the greatest treasure in Greek history, and the body of a great leader. At least, that's what he believes.
Schliemann found a male body in one of the graves. The man had apparently been buried in great haste, but he still had opulent burial objects and the most beautiful mask of all. So Schliemann was convinced he'd found Agamemnon, that it was the face of Agamemnon that was mirrored in the gold mask.
But he's wrong again. The golden mask certainly belonged to an important king, but it wasn't Agamemnon.
Schliemann was mistaken. We now know the dead man with the golden mask could not have been Agamemnon, as this man lived 400 to 500 years before the time of the Trojan Wars.
There is still no archaeological proof of Agamemnon's very existence. So was the Greek invasion of Troy the product of Homer's imagination? Or did the war really take place? The references to reality in Homer's epic poem still occupy scholars today. As a matter of fact, half the excavated layers in Troy testify to warlike disputes. This also goes for the layers which chronologically match Homer's tale of the Trojan War.
During the late Bronze Age in Troy, there are several burnt layers. We have skeletons in the streets, bronze arrowheads, not many, mind you, and we have knobs, which can be interpreted as dagger handles, and we have sling stones. Of course, they're just pebbles from a stream, but they are the right size and they've been found in piles. Sling stones are the typical weapon of the Bronze Age. They weren't thrown by hand, but with a proper sling. They accelerate to quite a high speed, and their impact can even injure a warrior in armor and wearing a helmet.
The dispute about the Trojan War takes us to Oxford University. Scholars have been working here for decades, trying to decipher thousands of fragments of papyrus from the Egyptian desert town of Oxyrhynchus. Recently, the remains of a poem from 700 BC were discovered. The verses shed new light on the Trojan War. The lines written by the Greek poet and soldier Archilochos confirm that the Trojan War wasn't just a figment of Homer's imagination.
The really groundbreaking surprise of the new Archilochus papyrus is it shows events of the Trojan War leading up to the battle, the arrival of the Greeks at Troy, the parts that Homer doesn't narrate, being told as early, if not earlier, than Homer.
Along with Homer's Iliad, the papyrus is the second source describing the dramatic events of the Late Bronze Age.
Archilochus tells in the poem about a defeat in battle of the Greeks on their way to Troy. They got lost, landed on the coast of Asia Minor, just south of Troy, and attacked the city of Mysia, thinking it was Troy.
The Greeks, hungry to expand, are defeated, but they return. However, they weren't taking on a mere regional fortress on this Anatolian coast. They faced an ancient Oriental superpower. According to the current state of research, Troy was not part of the region dominated by the Greeks. It was in the Hittite sphere of influence. The only bit of writing found in Troy is a seal with a Luwian inscription, a language used in the empire of the Hittites. This powerful people ruled large areas of Anatolia and Syria during the 2nd millennium BC. They were on equal footing with the great Egyptian empire. The Mycenaeans ran into one of the great powers of antiquity. This was probably the first East-West conflict in world history.
The Mycenaean Greeks expanded across the Aegean Sea to the west coast of Anatolia. There they built bridgeheads and colonies. The Hittites, the central Anatolian power, surged across from the other side, the east, and arrived at the Anatolian coast as well. And this, of course, led to conflicts of interest and disputes, which are reflected not only in destruction and battles that we can account for archaeologically, but also in the descriptions derived from the Hittites' writings.
In the end, the entire region is destroyed. The empire of the Hittites no longer exists. The Mycenaean palaces are burned to the ground, just like Troy. Antiquity is lost in darkness. What remains is the legend of a great battle, described 400 years later in Homer's Iliad. Trusting the lines of the poet, Schliemann searched for Priam's palace, and without realizing it, came across the remains of a great war between Europe and the Orient. People love an outsider. Schliemann's books become bestsellers, and with his spectacular finds, he brings the new science of archaeology into the public limelight. In 1881, he finally receives the recognition he so longed for. Thanks to Rudolf Virchow's intercession, Schliemann is appointed an honorary member of the Anthropological Society and becomes an honorary citizen of Berlin. In exchange, the finds from Troy are taken to Germany's capital. The opening of the exhibition is a national event. The self-made businessman and self-taught scholar has reached the pinnacle of fame. Even the German Kaiser personally expresses his appreciation for the services his dear Schliemann has rendered to the fatherland. This is Schliemann's final bow. Despite massive criticism, Schliemann has proved an ancient myth to be true. And at the same time, he created his own fantastic legend. The irony of it all is that, despite his exaggeration, this obsessive explorer came fairly close to describing reality. When Schliemann died in 1890, he knew that he had neither discovered the treasure of Priam, nor had he found the mask of Agamemnon. Nevertheless, he became the most famous archaeologist in the world. His wife, who would rather have died at the beginning of their marriage, upholds the memory of his life's work. We owe it to Heinrich Schliemann that Troy doesn't just live on as a myth, but is now a real place in the Atlas of world history.